Pay attention to the pilot kneeling by the flames. His name is Hassan. He just set multiple books on fire at Chicago Airport. Then sudden winds extinguish everything, papers scatter everywhere, and he collapses to his knees in complete shock.
My name is Hassan. I'm 42 years old, and on April 20th, 2020, I committed what I thought was a righteous act. I was a Saudi commercial pilot for 15 years, a devout Muslim who prayed 5 times daily. I burned Christian books at Chicago Airport. What happened next changed everything forever. I was born in Riyadh in 1978 to a family that breathed Islam. My father was an imam at our local mosque, and my mother taught Quranic studies to young girls in our neighborhood. From the moment I could speak, Arabic prayers flowed from my lips like water from a spring. By age 12, I had memorized the entire Quran, reciting its verses with the precision my father demanded. Our home was a sanctuary of Islamic devotion, where the call to prayer marked every moment of our day. My childhood was structured around the 5 pillars of Islam. We prayed together as a family, fasted during Ramadan despite my young age, and my father would tell me stories of our eventual pilgrimage to Mecca. I wore my faith like armor, proud to be chosen by Allah, convinced that Islam was the only true path to salvation. My father would often say that Christians and Jews were people of the book, but they had corrupted their scriptures, and only we Muslims possessed the final, uncorrupted Word of God. When I turned 18, I enrolled in the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals to study aviation. My dream was to become a pilot, to soar through the skies that Allah had created. During my training, I excelled in every subject. My instructors praised my discipline, which I credited entirely to my Islamic upbringing. The structure, the dedication, the unwavering commitment to excellence that Islam had instilled in me translated perfectly into aviation. In 2005, I was hired by Saudi Airlines as a junior pilot. Those early years were filled with domestic flights within the kingdom, and I felt comfortable in the familiar embrace of Islamic culture. Every airport, every passenger, every conversation reinforced my beliefs. I married my wife Fatima in 2007, and we were blessed with 2 children, a son named Ahmed and a daughter named Aisha. Our home became a reflection of my parents' house, centered around Islamic principles and traditions. But everything changed when I began flying international routes in 2008. Suddenly, I was exposed to the Western world in ways that shook my comfortable Islamic bubble. My first layover in London left me deeply disturbed. I saw churches on nearly every corner, crosses displayed prominently on buildings, and people openly carrying Bibles. What struck me most was not just their presence, but their confidence. These Christians walked with the same certainty that I had always believed belonged exclusively to Muslims. Have you ever felt your worldview challenged so fundamentally that it created anger instead of curiosity? That was my experience during those early international flights. Instead of seeing these encounters as opportunities to understand different perspectives, I felt attacked. Every church I passed felt like a personal insult to my faith. Every cross seemed to mock the crescent moon that adorned our mosques. Every Bible I glimpsed in airport bookstores felt like a deliberate provocation. My layovers in Paris were equally disturbing. The beautiful cathedrals that tourists admired filled me with rage. How dare these Christians build such magnificent structures when they worshipped a corrupted version of God's truth? How could they claim to follow Jesus, who I believed was merely a prophet, not the Son of God? Their very existence seemed to challenge everything my father had taught me, everything I had built my life upon. The worst experiences came during my layovers in American cities. New York, Los Angeles, Miami, each city seemed saturated with Christian influence. I would walk through airports and see chaplaincy services, Christian bookstores, and prayer rooms that welcomed all faiths. The inclusivity enraged me. In Saudi Arabia, our mosques were for Muslims only. Why were these Christians so eager to share their space with people who disagreed with them? I began to develop what I can only describe as a persecution complex. Every kind gesture from a Christian flight attendant felt condescending. Every Christmas decoration in December airports felt like a deliberate assault on my Islamic sensibilities. I started to view my job not just as flying planes, but as a Muslim warrior carrying the true faith into enemy territory. During layovers, I would seek out Islamic centers in whatever city I was visiting. I found communities of Muslim immigrants who shared my growing resentment toward Western Christianity. We would pray together and discuss how Christians were trying to convert Muslims through their kindness and generosity. We convinced ourselves that their charity was actually a form of spiritual warfare, a calculated attempt to undermine Islamic faith through false displays of love. My anger grew stronger with each international flight. I began to see patterns everywhere: Christian relief organizations in disaster zones, Christian hospitals treating Muslim patients, Christian schools accepting Muslim children. Instead of recognizing these as genuine acts of service, I interpreted them as strategic attacks on Islamic communities. My father had taught me that Christians were clever in their deceptions, and I believed I was seeing evidence of this everywhere I traveled. For 12 years, from 2008 to 2020, this resentment festered in my heart like an infected wound. Every international route reinforced my belief that Christianity was Islam's greatest enemy. I would return home to Saudi Arabia each time more convinced that I was a soldier in a spiritual war, defending the truth of Islam against Christian lies. Looking back now, I realized that my anger was actually fear in disguise. Deep down, I was terrified that these Christians might be right about something, and that possibility threatened everything I had built my identity upon. Instead of examining that fear honestly, I let it transform into the hatred that would eventually lead me to that tarmac in Chicago. April 20th, 2020 started like any other international flight. I was piloting Saudi Airlines Flight 847 from Riyadh to Toronto, a route I had flown dozens of times before. The passengers were a mix of Saudi business travelers and Canadian residents returning home. Everything was routine until we reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean. That's when our aircraft's hydraulic system began showing warning signs that would change the trajectory of my entire life. The first indicator appeared on my control panel at 35,000 feet. A yellow warning light signaled potential hydraulic fluid loss in our primary system. My co-pilot, a young man named Captain Abdullah, immediately began running through our emergency checklists. Within minutes, the yellow warning escalated to red, indicating a critical failure that required immediate attention. We had lost primary hydraulic pressure, making our aircraft difficult to control and potentially dangerous for landing. I radioed air traffic control and declared an emergency. They immediately began coordinating our diversion to the nearest suitable airport. Chicago O'Hare International Airport was our best option, with long runways and emergency services equipped to handle our situation. As we descended toward Chicago, I focused entirely on keeping our aircraft stable, while Abdullah coordinated with ground control and prepared our passengers for an emergency landing. The landing itself was successful, thanks to our backup hydraulic systems and years of emergency training. We touched down safely on runway 10L at O'Hare, and emergency vehicles immediately surrounded our aircraft. The passengers were evacuated without incident, and within an hour, everyone was safely inside the terminal. But our relief was short-lived when maintenance crews informed us that repairs would take at least 8 hours, possibly longer. This was April 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. O'Hare Airport, normally bustling with thousands of travelers, felt like a ghost town. Most shops were closed, restaurants operated with limited hours, and social distancing protocols kept the few remaining passengers spread far apart. The terminal that should have been filled with activity instead echoed with emptiness and the occasional announcement about health safety measures. Abdullah and I were provided with meal vouchers and told to find comfortable places to wait. The airline arranged hotel rooms for our passengers, but as crew members, we were required to stay near the aircraft in case maintenance needed our input. I found myself wandering through Terminal 2, trying to pass time in an environment that felt both familiar and strangely alien due to the pandemic restrictions. It was during one of these aimless walks that I discovered something that would trigger the rage I had been carrying for 12 years. Near Gate B12, in a quiet corner of the terminal, I found a small table set up by the airport chaplaincy service. On this table was a cardboard box with a handwritten sign that read, "Free Bibles for Travelers. May God bless your journey." The box contained perhaps 20 or 30 copies of the New Testament, along with some pamphlets about finding peace during difficult times. The sight of that box hit me like a physical blow. Here, in the middle of an international airport during a global pandemic, Christians were still trying to spread their corrupted message. They were taking advantage of people's vulnerability, their fear about the virus, their anxiety about travel delays. I saw it as the most calculated and manipulative form of religious predation I had ever encountered. I stood there staring at those books for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Every sermon my father had preached about Christian deception came flooding back to me. Every conversation with fellow Muslim pilots about Western religious imperialism echoed in my mind. Every moment of anger I had accumulated during 12 years of international flights crystallized into a burning hatred focused on that simple cardboard box. Have you ever felt anger so pure and focused that it seemed to give you clarity about your purpose in life? That's exactly what I experienced standing before those Bibles. I became convinced that Allah had orchestrated our mechanical failure specifically to place me in this position. This wasn't coincidence. This was divine appointment. I was being called to take a stand against Christian missionary activity in a way that would send a clear message. The terminal was nearly empty due to the pandemic, with most of the few remaining travelers clustered around gates in other concourses. Security personnel were minimal, and the cleaning crews were focused on sanitizing high-traffic areas. The chaplaincy table sat unattended in a corner that seemed forgotten by everyone except me. I realized that I could take action without being observed or interrupted. I began to formulate a plan that felt both righteous and necessary. I would take these Bibles to a location where I could destroy them completely, making a statement about Islamic resistance to Christian evangelism. The nearly empty airport provided the perfect opportunity to act without witnesses or interference. I convinced myself that burning these books would be a service to Allah and a warning to Christians who thought they could spread their false gospel without consequences. Looking around to ensure I wasn't being watched, I began collecting the Bibles from the box. I took perhaps a dozen copies, along with some of the accompanying pamphlets. My heart was racing with anticipation and what I believed was righteous anger. I felt like a warrior preparing for a sacred mission, defending the honor of Islam against Christian aggression. I remembered seeing a maintenance door that led to a secluded area near the tarmac during my earlier wandering. It was away from passenger areas, hidden from most security cameras, and unlikely to be disturbed during the quiet pandemic period. This would be the perfect location to make my statement. As I walked toward that door with my arms full of Christian literature, I felt more purposeful than I had in years. I had no idea that I was walking directly into an encounter that would shatter everything I believed about God, faith, and my own spiritual destiny. The maintenance door opened easily with my pilot credentials, leading me onto a quiet section of tarmac between Terminal 2 and the aircraft hangars. The April afternoon was crisp and clear, with virtually no wind and perfect visibility across the sprawling airport grounds. Due to the pandemic, air traffic was at historic lows, and this particular area felt completely abandoned. The only sounds were distant jet engines from the few aircraft still operating, and the occasional vehicle from maintenance crews working on other parts of the airfield. I found a spot near a concrete barrier, far enough from any buildings to avoid setting off smoke detectors, but close enough to the terminal that I could return quickly if needed. The location felt perfect for what I intended to do. I arranged the dozen Bibles and pamphlets in a neat pile on the asphalt, creating what I saw as an altar for my act of religious defiance. As I pulled out my lighter, a small disposable one I always carried for the occasional cigarette during long layovers, I felt a surge of righteous energy coursing through my body. This wasn't just about destroying some books. This was about making a statement that would echo through the spiritual realm. I was defending the honor of Islam, standing up to Christian missionary aggression, and serving Allah in a way that felt both personal and profound. I flicked the lighter and held the flame to the corner of the first Bible. The thin pages caught fire immediately, and I watched with satisfaction as the flames began to consume the book. The fire spread quickly through the lightweight paper, and I added pamphlets to feed the growing blaze. For those first few moments, I felt victorious, powerful, like a holy warrior striking a blow against the enemies of true faith. The flames grew higher as I added more materials to the fire. Each book that caught fire felt like a small victory, a piece of Christian deception being purified by Islamic righteousness. I remember thinking that my father would be proud of me for taking such a bold stand. I imagined telling my fellow Muslim pilots about this act of defiance and how they would celebrate my courage in confronting Christian evangelism so directly. But then, something happened that I still struggle to explain, even 4 years later. The weather had been perfectly calm just moments before, with absolutely no wind disturbing the still April air. Suddenly, without any warning or gradual build-up, a powerful gust of wind swept across the tarmac with incredible force. It wasn't a gentle breeze that gradually grew stronger. It was an instantaneous blast of air that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The wind hit the fire with such intensity that every flame was extinguished immediately. Not gradually snuffed out, not slowly diminished, but completely eliminated in a single moment. At the same time, the wind caught all the papers, both burned and unburned, and sent them swirling through the air in every direction around me. Pages from the Bibles I had been burning became airborne, spinning and dancing in the sudden windstorm, like autumn leaves caught in a tornado. I stood there in absolute shock, watching papers fly in circles around me. Some pages rose high into the air, others skittered across the tarmac, and several seemed to hover just above my head before settling gently to the ground. The entire scene felt surreal, like I was standing in the center of a localized hurricane that had appeared from nothing and was affecting only the immediate area around my fire. Then something happened that still gives me chills when I remember it. One single page, among all the papers swirling chaotically through the air, came floating directly toward my face. Not blown randomly in my direction, but moving in a straight line as if it had been deliberately aimed at me. The page hit me squarely in the face and stuck there for a moment before I could react. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever experienced something so impossible, so perfectly orchestrated, that you knew immediately it couldn't be coincidence? That's exactly what I felt as I peeled that page away from my face with trembling hands. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the sound of papers still settling around me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I felt a fear unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. I stumbled backward, dropping my lighter and nearly falling over the concrete barrier behind me. The sudden wind continued for perhaps another 30 seconds, ensuring that every piece of paper was scattered far from the original pile before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. The tarmac returned to its previous calm state, but I was no longer the same person who had lit that fire just minutes earlier. Looking down at the page, still clutched in my shaking hand, I saw words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was John 3:16, printed in clear black letters on white paper. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Those words seemed to burn themselves into my consciousness with an intensity far greater than any physical fire I had just attempted to create. I dropped to my knees among the scattered papers, not in worship, but because my legs simply gave out beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about God, about faith, about my own spiritual authority crumbled in that moment. The wind, the precision of that single page hitting my face, the specific verse it contained, all of it combined into an experience that shattered my Islamic certainty and left me gasping for breath on a Chicago airport tarmac. The fire I had started was completely extinguished, but something far more powerful had been ignited in my heart, something I didn't yet understand but couldn't ignore. Kneeling on that cold tarmac with John 3:16 clutched in my trembling hands, I felt like my entire world had been turned upside down in the span of a few seconds. My legs had simply given out beneath me, not from physical exhaustion, but from the overwhelming weight of what I had just experienced. The rational part of my mind kept trying to explain away what had happened. Wind gusts can occur suddenly at airports due to jet wash from aircraft, I told myself. Papers blow around randomly, and it was just coincidence that one happened to hit my face. But even as I tried to rationalize the experience, my heart knew better. The precision of that wind, the way it had extinguished every flame instantly, the surgical accuracy with which that single page had flown directly into my face, none of it felt random or coincidental. It felt orchestrated, purposeful, like I had just been on the receiving end of divine intervention from a God I didn't believe existed. I found myself compulsively gathering the scattered papers around me, crawling on my hands and knees across the rough asphalt to collect every piece I could find. This behavior made no logical sense. Just minutes earlier, I had been trying to destroy these very same pages, and now I was desperately trying to save them. My hands moved almost independently of my conscious will, reaching for Bible pages and pamphlets with an urgency I couldn't explain or control. As I collected each page, I couldn't stop myself from reading fragments of text. Verses about love, forgiveness, and redemption seemed to jump out at me from every piece of paper I touched. Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Neither height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. These words were completely foreign to my Islamic understanding of God. In Islam, Allah was distant, demanding, quick to judge and slow to forgive. The Quran spoke of God's mercy, but always in the context of strict obedience and perfect submission. But these Christian verses painted a picture of a God who pursued people with love, who offered rest to the weary, who made plans for human prosperity and happiness. It was a vision of divinity that I had never encountered before, and it both terrified and attracted me. The page containing John 3:16 remained in my hand throughout this frantic collection process. I must have read those words 50 times in the span of 10 minutes, and each reading seemed to reveal new layers of meaning. God so loved the world, not just Muslims, not just the righteous, not just those who followed the correct religious practices, but the entire world. This was a love that transcended religious boundaries and ethnic divisions in ways that challenged everything I had been taught about God's selective favor. But the phrase that truly shattered my Islamic worldview was His one and only Son. Christianity's central claim, the doctrine that had always seemed most blasphemous to my Muslim mind, now stared back at me from that wind-blown page. I had been taught that attributing sonship to God was the ultimate sin, shirk, the one unforgivable transgression in Islamic theology. Yet here I was, holding evidence of what felt like divine intervention, delivered through a book that proclaimed this very doctrine. Something was happening inside my chest that I had never experienced before. It felt like my heart was literally breaking apart and being rebuilt simultaneously. Tears began streaming down my face, not tears of sadness or joy, but tears of complete spiritual confusion and overwhelming conviction. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into a void that would either destroy me or transform me completely. Without thinking, without planning, without any conscious decision, I began to pray. But the words that came out of my mouth were not the familiar Arabic prayers I had recited 5 times daily for 37 years. Instead, I found myself crying out to Jesus, the very figure I had been taught to respect as a prophet, but never to worship as God. Jesus, I whispered through my tears, if you are real, if you are truly God's Son, help me understand what just happened here. The words felt foreign on my tongue, like speaking a language I had never learned, but somehow knew instinctively. I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything I thought I knew about God feels wrong right now. Show me the truth, even if it destroys everything I've built my life upon. Have you ever prayed a prayer that you knew might change everything about your life? That's exactly what I was doing, kneeling on that airport tarmac surrounded by scattered Bible pages. I was essentially asking God to reveal Himself to me, knowing that such a revelation might cost me my family, my career, my entire identity as a Saudi Muslim pilot. As I knelt there praying to Jesus for the first time in my life, I heard footsteps approaching across the tarmac. My heart jumped with panic as I realized that someone had discovered me in this compromising position. I quickly began shoving the collected papers into my pilot uniform jacket, trying to hide the evidence of what had transpired. A security officer appeared around the corner of the concrete barrier, walking with the casual pace of someone making routine rounds rather than investigating suspicious activity. "Everything all right over here?" he called out, his tone more concerned than suspicious. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who had worked outdoors for many years. His name tag identified him as Officer Martinez, and his accent suggested Hispanic heritage. I stood up quickly, brushing dust off my knees and trying to compose myself despite the emotional turmoil raging inside me. "Yes, sir," I replied, falling back on my professional pilot training to project calm authority. "I'm Captain Hassan with Saudi Airlines. Our aircraft is undergoing maintenance, and I was just getting some fresh air during the delay." Officer Martinez looked around at the few remaining scattered papers and the small pile of ash where my fire had been. I held my breath, waiting for him to ask the obvious questions about what had been burning and why Bible pages were scattered across the tarmac. But instead, he simply nodded with understanding. "Long delays can be frustrating," he said, sympathetically. "Looks like some trash got blown around out here. Wind can be unpredictable near the terminals." He began helping me pick up the remaining papers, apparently assuming I had been cleaning up litter rather than creating it. "You pilots work hard. Take care of yourself during the wait." I thanked him and assured him I was heading back inside shortly. As he walked away, continuing his security rounds, I realized that my pilot uniform and professional demeanor had provided perfect cover for what had just occurred. To him, I appeared to be a responsible crew member cleaning up wind-blown debris rather than a man whose entire faith had just been shaken to its core. But I knew the truth. And as I walked back toward the terminal with Bible pages hidden in my jacket and John 3:16 still clutched in my hand, I knew there was no going back to the man I had been just an hour earlier. The flight back to Riyadh 8 hours later felt like the longest journey of my life. While Captain Abdullah slept in the seat beside me and our passengers dozed through the overnight flight, I sat in the cockpit with those hidden Bible pages burning like coals in my jacket pocket. Every few minutes, I would discreetly pull out the John 3:16 page and read it again under the dim instrument lighting. Each reading seemed to deepen the spiritual earthquake that had begun on that Chicago tarmac. During the 13-hour flight, I found myself doing something I had never done before, questioning everything my father had taught me about Christianity. If Christians were truly the enemies of Islam, if their scriptures were corrupted and their faith was built on lies, then how could I explain what had happened at O'Hare? The supernatural wind, the precise placement of that Bible page, the overwhelming sense of divine presence I had felt. None of it aligned with the Christian deception I had been taught to expect. When I finally arrived home in Riyadh, I went through the motions of normal life while fighting an internal war that threatened to consume me. I hugged my wife Fatima and my children Ahmed and Aisha, performed my ritual washing, and joined my family for evening prayers. But as I knelt on my prayer rug facing Mecca, the familiar Arabic words felt hollow and mechanical. Instead of communing with Allah, I found myself thinking about that verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Over the next several weeks, I began conducting secret research that would have horrified my family and cost me my job if discovered. During layovers in hotels around the world, I would lock my door and use secure internet connections to study Christianity online. I read about the life of Jesus, the claims of the gospel writers, and testimonies from former Muslims who had converted to Christianity. Each article, each video, each testimony felt like another piece of evidence in a case I was building against my own lifelong beliefs. The more I learned about Christian doctrine, the more it challenged my Islamic understanding of God. In Islam, I had been taught that humans were fundamentally separated from God by an unbridgeable gulf of divine transcendence. We could submit to Allah, obey His commands, and hope for mercy, but we could never truly know Him or have a personal relationship with Him. But Christianity taught something radically different, that God had become human specifically to bridge that gap, to make personal relationship possible, to offer unconditional love rather than conditional mercy. My family began noticing changes in my behavior that I couldn't hide. Fatima commented that I seemed distracted during family prayers, that I was spending unusual amounts of time on my computer, and that I was asking strange questions about God's nature. My 12-year-old son Ahmed asked me why I had stopped telling him stories from the Quran at bedtime, a tradition I had maintained since his early childhood. I deflected their concerns with excuses about work stress and difficult flight schedules, but I could see the worry growing in their eyes. The professional challenges were becoming equally difficult to manage. During flights, I found myself making small errors that had never been problems before. I missed radio calls while lost in thought about Christian theology, made minor navigation mistakes while contemplating the implications of Jesus' divinity, and struggled to concentrate on standard procedures while wrestling with questions about salvation and redemption. My co-pilots began to notice, and I overheard one of them expressing concern to our flight operations manager about my recent performance. Have you ever tried to live two completely different lives simultaneously? The psychological stress was overwhelming. By day, I maintained the facade of a devout Muslim pilot, praying publicly with my crew, discussing Islamic topics with passengers, and upholding the religious image expected of a Saudi Airlines captain. But by night, in the privacy of hotel rooms thousands of miles from home, I was secretly studying the very faith I had tried to destroy on that Chicago tarmac. 3 months after the incident at O'Hare, while staying overnight in a Dubai hotel during a layover to Mumbai, I reached the breaking point in my spiritual journey. I had been reading through a complete New Testament I had purchased from a Christian bookstore in London, hiding it inside the cover of an aviation manual to avoid detection. The Gospel of John, with its emphasis on Jesus as the Son of God, both terrified and attracted me with its bold theological claims. That night in Dubai, alone in my hotel room with the city lights twinkling outside my window, I made the most important decision of my life. I knelt beside my bed, not facing Mecca as I had done thousands of times before, but simply kneeling in surrender to a God I was only beginning to understand. With tears streaming down my face, I prayed what Christians call the sinner's prayer, asking Jesus Christ to become my Lord and Savior, to forgive my sins, and to transform my life according to His will. The moment I spoke those words, I felt a peace that I had never experienced in 37 years of Islamic devotion. It wasn't the peace of religious duty fulfilled or spiritual discipline maintained, but the peace of coming home to a God who had been pursuing me with love even when I was trying to destroy His word. I understood in that hotel room in Dubai that the wind at Chicago O'Hare had not been a coincidence or a natural phenomenon, but the breath of God Himself, stopping my destructive act and redirecting my life toward His truth. But even as I celebrated this newfound peace privately, I knew that my public life was about to become exponentially more complicated. I was now a secret Christian living in one of the world's most restrictive Islamic societies, employed by a national airline that expected religious orthodoxy from its pilots, married to a woman who had never questioned Islamic doctrine, and father to children who had been raised to view Christianity as spiritual error. The joy of my conversion was immediately tempered by the sobering realization that I would now have to navigate the dangerous waters of religious conversion in a country where such changes could cost me everything I held dear. I was a new Christian with a Muslim family, a Saudi pilot with a Western faith, and a man caught between two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. As I lay in that Dubai hotel bed, still glowing with the warmth of my new faith, but already dreading the challenges ahead, I had no idea how costly my decision to follow Jesus would ultimately prove to be. For 8 months after my conversion in that Dubai hotel room, I lived the most challenging double life imaginable. Every morning, I would wake up in my Riyadh home and perform the ritual washing expected of a devout Muslim husband and father. I would join my family for dawn prayers, reciting Arabic verses from the Quran while my heart was actually worshiping Jesus Christ. The hypocrisy ate away at my soul, but I convinced myself that I was protecting my family from a truth they weren't ready to handle. During this period, I became expert at finding Christian fellowship in the most unlikely places. I discovered underground networks of converted Muslims and expatriate Christians throughout the Middle East who met in secret locations for worship and Bible study. In Kuwait, I found a group that gathered in a British engineer's apartment every Thursday evening. In Bahrain, I connected with Filipino domestic workers who held prayer meetings in public parks, disguised as family gatherings. These believers became my lifeline, the only people in the world who knew the truth about my faith. My flight schedule became my cover for spiritual growth. During layovers in London, I would attend services at Westminster Chapel. In Paris, I found an English-speaking evangelical church that welcomed me despite my obvious Middle Eastern appearance and the nervousness I displayed whenever I entered their building. In New York, I began meeting regularly with a pastor who specialized in ministering to Muslim converts, helping me understand biblical doctrine and navigate the unique challenges of secret Christianity. But the strain of living two lives was taking a devastating toll on every aspect of my existence. At home, Fatima noticed that I had become distant and preoccupied. She complained that I no longer engaged in religious discussions with our children, that I seemed uncomfortable during family prayers, and that I had stopped attending Friday prayers at our local mosque whenever I was in Riyadh. My explanations about work stress and exhaustion were becoming increasingly unconvincing. The breaking point came in January 2021 during a routine cleaning of our home office. Fatima was organizing my desk drawers when she discovered the items that would destroy our marriage and shatter our family. Hidden beneath flight manuals and navigation charts, she found a complete Arabic-English New Testament, printed notes from Christian sermons I had attended, and most damaging of all, that original John 3:16 page from Chicago O'Hare that I had kept as a reminder of my conversion experience. The confrontation that followed was the most painful experience of my life. Fatima stood in our living room holding these Christian materials, her face a mixture of horror, betrayal, and absolute disbelief. She demanded an explanation, and after months of deception, I found myself unable to continue lying to the woman I loved. Through tears, I told her everything: the incident at Chicago, my secret research, my conversion in Dubai, and my hidden Christian faith. Her reaction was exactly what I had feared most. She screamed that I had betrayed Allah, dishonored our family, and corrupted everything our marriage represented. She called me an apostate and a traitor to Islam, Saudi Arabia, and our children's future. Within hours, she had contacted her father, her brothers, and the imam at our mosque. By evening, our house was filled with family members and religious authorities demanding that I renounce Christianity and return to Islamic orthodoxy. The ultimatum they presented was stark and unforgiving. Either I would publicly confess my error, undergo religious rehabilitation, and demonstrate renewed commitment to Islam, or I would lose my wife, my children, my job, and potentially my freedom. Saudi Arabia's apostasy laws made conversion from Islam a capital offense, and several family members made it clear that they viewed my betrayal as deserving of the ultimate punishment. Looking around that room at the faces of people who had loved me for decades, people who now viewed me as a dangerous enemy of everything they held sacred, I realized that my choice was between my earthly family and my heavenly Father. Have you ever faced a decision where every option leads to devastating loss, but one option leads to spiritual destruction? That's exactly where I found myself on that January evening in 2021. With a breaking heart but unwavering conviction, I told them that I could not and would not renounce Jesus Christ. I explained that the God I had encountered was not the enemy of Islam, but the fulfillment of humanity's search for divine love and redemption. I tried to share how Jesus had transformed my understanding of God from a distant judge to a loving Father who pursued his children with infinite grace. Their response was swift and brutal. Fatima filed for immediate divorce, claiming abandonment and religious incompatibility. Saudi Airlines launched an investigation into my fitness for duty, ultimately terminating my employment for conduct incompatible with Islamic values and Saudi national identity. Most devastating of all, I was prohibited from any contact with Ahmed and Aisha. My beloved children who were told that their father had become dangerous and corrupted by Western influences. Within 6 weeks, I had lost everything that had defined my identity for 42 years. I was unemployed, divorced, separated from my children, and facing potential criminal charges for apostasy. But Christian organizations that specialized in helping Muslim converts had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Through their underground network, they arranged for me to flee Saudi Arabia and seek asylum in the United States. The journey to America was terrifying and heartbreaking. I left Riyadh with nothing but a single suitcase and the certain knowledge that I would probably never see my homeland or my children again. During the long flight to New York, the same route I had flown dozens of times as a Saudi Airlines captain, I grieved for everything I was leaving behind while simultaneously thanking God for the freedom to worship Him openly that awaited me in America. My asylum case was approved after 8 months of legal proceedings, during which Christian volunteers provided housing, legal assistance, and emotional support. I found work as a flight instructor at a small airport in North Carolina, earning a fraction of my former salary, but experiencing a joy in my work that I had never known as a commercial pilot. The students I taught were often surprised to learn that their instructor was a former Saudi Airlines captain who had given up everything to follow Jesus. 3 years later, I enrolled in seminary to prepare for pastoral ministry, feeling called to serve other Muslim converts who were navigating the same impossible choices I had faced. My specialization became helping Middle Eastern refugees and immigrants understand the gospel in ways that honored their cultural background while introducing them to the transformative love of Christ. Today, as I stand before you sharing this testimony, I serve as associate pastor at a church that has become home to former Muslims from 12 different countries. We worship together in Arabic, English, Farsi, and Urdu, united not by our cultural backgrounds, but by our shared experience of encountering Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Every Sunday, I look out at faces that reflect my own journey from Islam to Christianity, and I'm reminded that God can use even our most destructive intentions to accomplish His perfect will. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question. What would you be willing to sacrifice to follow the truth about God, even if that truth challenged everything you thought you knew about faith, family, and identity? That's the question I faced on a Chicago airport tarmac when I tried to burn books that contained the very words of life I desperately needed. The greatest irony of my story is that the Bible I attempted to destroy became the source of my salvation. The Jesus I had been taught to reject as a false prophet revealed Himself to be the Son of God who loved me enough to stop my destructive act and redirect my life toward eternal hope. From Saudi pilot burning Bibles to American pastor preaching from them, only the grace of Jesus Christ could author such an impossible transformation. If God can change the heart of a man who was literally burning His word in hatred and rebellion, He can certainly change your heart today, regardless of what you've done or how far you think you've wandered from His love.